Ethan Carter had never imagined he'd be living in the quiet, cookie-cutter neighborhood of Willow Creek. The last place he wanted to be was in a suburban enclave where the Homeowners Association, HOA, wielded power like a medieval fiefdom. But life had a way of appending plans. His grandfather, Walter Carter, an 82-year-old war veteran with a spine of steel, had been living in the same house for over 4 decades. Walter was a man who had seen the world change around him, but his home had remained a constant until now. The trouble began when the HOA, led by the iron-fisted Margaret Holloway, set their sights on Walter's property. Margaret was the kind of woman who could find fault in a perfect sunset. She walked the neighborhood with a clipboard, her sharp eyes scanning for the slightest infraction: a blade of grass too long, a mailbox slightly askew, or a flower color not approved by the HOA's stringent guidelines. At first, the harassment was petty. Fines for minor violations started appearing in Walter's mailbox. Unapproved flower colors, grass length exceeding regulation, a mailbox tilted a few degrees off-center. Walter laughed it off. "I was here before that woman even knew what an HOA was," he grumbled over breakfast one morning. "You think I'm going to let her tell me what to do?" But the fines didn't stop. When Walter ignored them, the warnings escalated. Threats of legal action followed, and soon, Walter's name was being dragged through the mud at every HOA board meeting. The real reason behind the harassment soon became clear. Margaret wanted Walter's house. Not for herself, of course, but for a real estate developer who had been circling the neighborhood like a vulture, eager to snatch up properties for dirt cheap, renovate them, and sell them to wealthy families desperate to live in a charming, well-regulated community. Walter, however, wasn't selling. He had faced far worse than a nosy suburban tyrant with a god complex. He dug his heels in and refused to budge. And that was when the gloves came off. It started one night when Ethan heard rustling in the kitchen. At first, he thought it was just the house settling, the kind of sound you learn to ignore in an old home. But when he flipped on the light, his stomach turned. A rat, a big one, was sitting right on the counter like it owned the place. Ethan grabbed a broom, ready to send the thing into the next dimension, but as soon as he moved, 2 more scurried out from under the fridge. Then another, and another. By morning, the problem had escalated. Walter woke up to find droppings in the pantry, chewed wires, shredded papers. It was as if someone had set off a tiny nuclear bomb of filth in the house overnight. That's when Ethan checked the security cameras. The footage made his blood boil. 4 HOA members dressed in black, sneaking around the backyard in the dead of night, each of them carrying a small crate. They slipped through the fence, tiptoed to the house, and carefully opened the vents near the foundation. Then they dumped the boxes. Ethan didn't need to see what was inside to know. His jaw clenched as he watched the figures scurry away, laughing among themselves, patting each other on the back like they had just done a public service. Margaret Holloway had sent rats into Walter's house. It wasn't just a prank. It wasn't just harassment. This was war. And Ethan was ready to fight back. Ethan had never been the type to back down. Fear was something he had learned to push aside a long time ago. Growing up on his grandfather's farm, he had spent his childhood knee-deep in dirt, chasing after creatures that would have sent most kids running: spiders, lizards, snakes. Snakes especially had fascinated him. While most people saw them as nightmares slithering through the grass, Ethan saw something else: patience, precision, power. His grandfather had taught him early on that snakes weren't to be feared, they were to be respected. And if you knew how to handle them, if you understood their nature, you could control the situation instead of letting it control you. That lesson had stuck with him. And now, standing in the ruins of his grandfather's home, the stench of rat droppings still clinging to the air, Ethan knew exactly how he was going to fight back. They wanted to play dirty? Fine. He'd show them what dirty really looked like. Without hesitation, he grabbed his keys and jumped into his truck, gripping the steering wheel with knuckles that had gone white. The engine roared to life, and within minutes, he was speeding down the road, weaving through traffic with a singular focus. The local exotic pet store sat at the edge of town, tucked between a pawn shop and a rundown diner, the kind of place that most people drove past without a second glance. But Ethan knew better. This store had exactly what he needed. As he pushed open the glass door, a bell jingled above him. The air was thick with the scent of warm straw, damp wood, and something faintly reptilian. Ethan had been here before, years ago, when he was still a kid, begging his grandfather to let him bring home a pet corn snake. Now, he wasn't here for a pet. A thin man with a patchy beard and a faded hoodie stood behind the counter, idly scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up as Ethan approached. "Help you with something?" the man asked. Ethan set his hands on the counter and leaned in slightly. "I need snakes. A lot of them." That got the guy's attention. He blinked, lowering his phone. What kind of snakes exactly?" "Non-venomous," Ethan said. "But creepy as hell." The man scratched his chin. You got a permit." Ethan slid a roll of cash onto the counter. "Let's say I've got an understanding." The guy hesitated, then shrugged. "All right, man. Follow me." He led Ethan through a door into the back room, where rows of glass tanks lined the walls. Inside, coiled and writhing, were creatures that made most people's skin crawl. Rat snakes, bull snakes, milk snakes harmless to humans, but enough to trigger every primal fear lurking in the back of the human brain. Ethan smiled. "Perfect. I'll take as many as you can legally sell me." The guy gave him a wary look. "You're not, feeding these to anything weird, are you?" Ethan chuckled. "No. Just, relocating them." The man didn't ask any more questions. Within 30 minutes, Ethan walked out with several carefully packed containers, each holding a slithering passenger. He loaded them into the truck with the kind of careful expertise that came from years of handling these creatures. As he sat behind the wheel, he exhaled slowly, his grip easing just a little. This wasn't just about revenge. This was about sending a message. The HOA had made a mistake. They had thought they could bully his grandfather. They had thought they could push them out, force them to give up. But they had forgotten something important. Ethan didn't scare easy. And now, it was his turn to make them squirm. The night was thick with silence, the kind that wrapped around a place just before chaos erupted. Ethan moved through the shadows, his footsteps soundless on the damp grass. The hood of his sweatshirt was pulled low over his face, gloves snug around his fingers. He wasn't taking any chances, not that he expected anyone in this pristine, rule-obsessed neighborhood to be awake past 10 p.m. The kind of people who weaponized an HOA were the same kind who prided themselves on their early-to-bed, early-to-rise routines. Perfect. Tucked beneath his jacket was a bag, and inside that bag, several sleek, writhing bodies shifted restlessly. Non-venomous, harmless to humans, but the moment they were set loose, they'd slither into the darkest corners, coil inside vents, disappear beneath furniture, and wait. Ethan knew people. He knew fear. And there was nothing quite like the fear of something cold and scaly brushing against your ankle in the middle of the night. His first stop was the Queen herself, Margaret Holloway. Her house was as obnoxious as she was perfectly manicured hedges, porch lights that glowed like a storefront display, security cameras positioned on every corner. If the HOA had a throne room, this was it. But Ethan had done his homework. He knew her blind spots, knew exactly where to move, where to crouch, how to slip past the reach of the cameras without triggering a single alert. He reached the side of the house and crouched near the foundation, his fingers tracing along the metal grates covering the ventilation system. It took less than a minute to pry one loose. Carefully, he opened the bag. Inside, the snakes coiled and twisted, their smooth bodies brushing against his gloves as they tasted the night air. Ethan had chosen them wisely. Rat snakes, corn snakes, a couple of king snakes for good measured docile creatures. But quick, clever. The moment he tipped the bag forward, they wasted no time. They slithered into the darkness of the vent, disappearing one by one. Ethan secured the grate back in place. Step 1 complete. But he wasn't done. He made his way down the street, slipping between yards like a ghost in the night. Next stop, Roger Clark. Clark was Margaret's most loyal lapdog, a man whose entire personality revolved around enforcing the HOA's ridiculous rules with an iron fist. He was the kind of guy who called the cops on kids for selling lemonade without a permit, the kind of guy who measured the height of his neighbor's grass and reported them for a quarter-inch discrepancy. His house was even easier to break in tonneau cameras. No security system, just a lock on the backyard gate that Ethan easily unlatched. The vents were lower to the ground here, wide enough that when Ethan loosened the cover, he barely had to nudge the snakes inside before they disappeared. He moved on. Linda Hayes, Paul Rourke. One by one, he cited the homes of every board member who had taken part in the rat stunt. The process became rhythmic. Kneel, loosen, vent, release, secure, move. Each time, the bag grew lighter, the adrenaline in his veins sharper. He imagined what the morning would bring: the chaos, the screaming, the sheer unfiltered panic when these self-important control freaks realized their pristine, regulation-approved homes had been invaded by something they couldn't find into submission. By the time he reached the last house, the bag was empty. Ethan exhaled slowly, letting the satisfaction settle in his chest. Tomorrow was going to be interesting. The morning air was shattered by a scream so sharp it could have cracked glass. It came from Margaret Holloway's house, high-pitched and frantic, followed almost immediately by the sound of something crashing to the floor. Ethan, already sipping his coffee on his grandfather's porch, didn't even flinch. Right on time. A second scream followed, this time from down the street. Then another. And another. The neighborhood, normally a picture of quiet, HOA-enforced perfection, had erupted into chaos. Margaret came bolting out of her front door, still in her robe and slippers, her face twisted in horror. She practically tripped over her own feet, arms flailing as she shrieked. "There's something under my bed. It's hissing. Oh my God, it's hissing." Before the first neighbor could even react, Roger Clark's door flew open. Unlike Margaret, Roger didn't run. He slammed the door behind him so hard the whole porch rattled. His face was pale, his chest heaving, his hands gripping his phone like a lifeline. "There's a snake in my bathroom," he wheezed. "Two saw it when I went to brush my teeth. It was just there, staring at me. It's huge, a goddamn anaconda." It was, in fact, a harmless rat snake. But Ethan wasn't about to correct him. More neighbors were stepping onto their porches now, some rubbing sleep from their eyes, others already recording. And then another shriek. Linda Hayes, another HOA board member, burst onto her front lawn, hopping on one foot, shaking what looked like a bedroom slipper in the air. "It crawled into my shoe. I almost stepped on it. I felt it move." Ethan took another slow sip of coffee. "Beautiful." Then came Paul Rourke. Unlike the others, Paul didn't run. He came storming out, gripping a shovel like he was about to go to war. "Where is it?" he roared. And at that exact moment, a small, dark shape slithered out from under his porch. Paul locked eyes with it. The snake froze. Paul froze. Then, in an impressive display of both panic and bad aim, he hurled the shovel at absolutely nothing, missed entirely, and took off running. The neighborhood had officially turned into a scene straight out of a bad comedy sketch. Phones were out, neighbors whispering. Did they say snakes? Where the hell did they come from? Dude, someone had to have done this on purpose. Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his chair, thoroughly satisfied. This was only the beginning. By the next morning, the neighborhood was a war zone. Police cars lined the perfectly paved streets, their flashing lights bouncing off the pristine lawns and freshly painted mailboxes. A van from Animal Control was parked right in front of Margaret Holloway's house, where two uniformed officers were currently hauling out yet another terrified and completely harmless snake from beneath a couch. Ethan stood at a distance, watching as Margaret hovered near her front steps. Her face was a shade paler than usual. Her robe was gone, replaced by one of her usual stiff, pressed outfits. But the carefully curated composure she always carried was crumbling fast. This was not how she had expected her week to go. A small crowd had gathered. Neighbors whispered, some amused, others genuinely concerned. The HOA board members, those who hadn't barricaded themselves inside out of sheer terror, stood in a tense cluster near Margaret, their faces a mix of frustration, exhaustion, and, for at least one of them, sheer regret. Then, finally, the pressure broke. Mr. Hall, one of the older board members, a man who had always looked slightly uncomfortable with Margaret's iron grip over the HOA, let out a sharp breath and took a step forward. "We need to stop this," he said, his voice tight. Margaret's head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. "Excuse me." Hall gestured vaguely at the chaos. "The police, the animal control officers currently trying to wrangle another snake out of someone's laundry room, the neighbors filming everything on their phones. This has gone too far." Margaret's expression twitched. "I don't know what you're implying." "You know exactly what I'm implying." Hall's voice hardened. "The rats, Margaret. The rats." The murmuring among the neighbors grew louder. Ethan could see people exchanging glances, nodding. We tried to drive Walter out, Paul continued, rubbing a hand over his face. And it didn't work. And instead of backing off, instead of acting like sane people, we released rodents into his home like psychopaths. And now, look at us. He threw a hand toward the commotion behind him. Animal control is dragging snakes out of our vents. The whole neighborhood is talking about us. This is insanity. Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. We did what we had to do. That house is a... I'm done. Hall cut her off, his voice cracking slightly, but it was steady. I'm out. I'm resigning from the HOA. For a second, there was silence. Then, all heads turned as another board member, Linda Hayes, lifted her chin. Her face was still tight with residual fear from her early morning encounter with a snake, but her voice was steady. He's right. This isn't what I signed up for. Another beat of silence. Then Roger Clark exhaled through his nose. Yeah, I'm done too. One by one, heads nodded. The board was fracturing. Margaret's hands clenched at her sides, her knuckles white. You're all being ridiculous, she snapped. You're overreacting. Am I? Hall challenged. He turned to face the crowd, where more neighbors were listening in. Because you can bet this isn't staying in the neighborhood. By the end of the day, this will be all over social media. Maybe even the news. You think people are going to ignore the fact that the HOA board was caught sneaking into a veteran's house and dumping rats into his vents? We're finished, Margaret. You're finished. The words hit like a death sentence. Margaret's jaw tightened, her nostrils flaring. But she saw the way people were looking at her. Not just the board. The neighborhood. The power she had spent years building was slipping through her fingers like sand. And there wasn't a damn thing she could do about it. The HOA meeting was held in the same dull, beige community center where every other meeting had taken place. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the rows of metal folding chairs. The atmosphere, however, was anything but sterile. This wasn't just another petty discussion about mailbox colors or lawn heights. This was a trial. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Residents filled the chairs, some standing against the back wall when the seats ran out. Normally, HOA meetings were sparsely attended, with only the most uptight rule followers bothering to show up. But tonight, the whole damn neighborhood had turned up, eager to witness what they all knew was coming. At the front of the room, Margaret Holloway sat stiffly at the long table where the board members usually presided. Her back was ramrod straight, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white. She had spent years lording over this neighborhood, dictating every inch of its existence like a suburban queen. But tonight, for the first time, she wasn't in control. And she knew it. The whispers in the room had started long before the meeting was officially called to order. They're really doing it. She's getting voted out. No way she survives this. I told you something like this would happen. You can't run a place like a damn dictatorship forever. Ethan leaned back in his chair near the middle of the room, arms crossed, watching. He didn't need to say anything, didn't need to stir the pot. Margaret had already done the damage herself. The moment the rat stunt had come to light, her support had started to crumble. At first, she had tried to deny it, claimed the footage was grainy, that it couldn't possibly be real. But when multiple board members resigned in shame, when half the neighborhood started openly discussing the pattern of harassment under her leadership, when news of the snake incident spread like wildfire online, even Margaret's most loyal lapdogs had begun to back away from her like she was radioactive. And now here they were. The vote was a formality at this point. Everyone knew how it was going to end. The meeting was called to order. The charges were read out. HOA regulations dictated that an official vote be taken to remove a sitting board member, and as much as Margaret would have loved to weasel her way out of it, even she couldn't ignore the process. One by one, the board members, what was left of them, raised their hands in favor of removal. One by one, the residents followed. Some did it without hesitation. Some hesitated, their gazes flickering toward Margaret as if wondering if she still had enough venom left in her to make their lives hell. But in the end, it didn't matter. When the final tally was read aloud, the decision was clear, majority vote. Margaret Holloway was officially removed as head of the HOA. For the first time since the meeting started, Ethan saw fear flash in her eyes. It was only for a second, quickly masked by anger, but he caught it. She had lost. The realization set in slowly, her breath coming shorter, her jaw tightening. Then, as the murmuring began to rise, she shoved her chair back with enough force to make it screech against the linoleum. The room fell silent. Margaret pushed herself to her feet, her face an unnatural shade of red, her hands trembling with barely restrained rage. She scanned the room, eyes darting from face to face, looking for someone in who might still be on her side. No one met her gaze. The weight of her defeat pressed down, making her look smaller than she ever had before. And that's when the fury spilled over. Her lips curled back as she hissed through clenched teeth, "You'll pay for this." The threat lingered in the air, sharp and ugly. And yet, no one reacted. No gasps, no protests, no nervous shifting in seats. Just silence. Not because they were afraid, because they didn't care. For years, Margaret Holloway had ruled this place through intimidation, through the fear of fines and consequences, through the illusion of power. But tonight, that illusion had shattered. She had nothing left, and the neighborhood had moved on before she had even left the room. She stood there for a moment longer, shaking with indignation, waiting, hoping for someone to acknowledge her, to react, to give her something. No one did. Finally, with a sharp, frustrated inhale, she turned on her heel and stormed out. The door slammed shut behind her. Ethan exhaled, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied smirk. Game over. A month passed, and with it, the chaos faded. The rats were gone. The neighborhood had returned to its pristine, regulation-approved state. No more HOA letters stuffed in the mailbox. No more ridiculous fines for imaginary infractions. No more late-night scheming from a woman who had once ruled this place like a suburban warlord. Margaret Holloway was out. A new board had been elected, one that actually seemed interested in maintaining order rather than terrorizing residents for power trips and personal vendettas. Things were peaceful for the first time in years. Walter could jest. Live. He sat on his porch that afternoon, watching as Ethan strolled across the yard. The old man had his usual cup of coffee in one hand, the other resting on the worn arm of his chair. He looked more relaxed than he had in months, maybe years. There was a certain satisfaction in his expression, like a man who had served vet a war and come out the other side victorious. Ethan plopped down into the chair next to him, stretching his legs out with an easy confidence. The afternoon air was warm, the scent of freshly cut grass hanging in the breeze. Walter exhaled, shaking his head with a quiet chuckle. "You know," he said, taking a sip of coffee, "it's funny. One day, I'm getting threatened with legal action over the angle of my mailbox, and the next, the HOA's bending over backward to make sure I don't move out." Ethan smirked. "Guess they finally realized what a valuable asset you are to the community." Walter gave him a sidelong glance, unimpressed. "Right. That must be it." A pause. Then Walter leaned forward slightly, fixing his grandson with that sharp, knowing look, the same one he had given Ethan 1,000 times before, when he was a kid sneaking cookies before dinner or trying to talk his way out of a scraped knee. "You didn't do anything special, did you?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He let the question hang between them, rolling it around in his mind like a well-kept secret. Then, slowly, a grin stretched across his face. "Of course not, Grandpa," he said smoothly. "I just reminded them that nature always finds a way to restore balance." Walter raised an eyebrow but didn't press. He had known Ethan long enough to recognize that whatever had really happened, it wasn't something he wanted on record. And honestly, that was probably for the best. The weeks following Margaret Holloway's ousting were a time of quiet reflection for the residents of Willow Creek. The neighborhood, once a battleground of petty grievances and power struggles, began to heal. The new HOA board, led by a more reasonable and community-minded president, focused on fostering a sense of unity rather than division. Fines for minor infractions became a thing of the past, and the once oppressive rules were relaxed to allow for more personal expression. Ethan, however, remained vigilant. He knew that while Margaret was gone, the seeds of her influence might still linger in the hearts of some residents. He kept a close eye on the neighborhood, ensuring that no one would attempt to resurrect the old regime. One evening, as Ethan and Walter sat on the porch enjoying the cool autumn air, a familiar figure approached. It was Mr. Hall, the former board member who had been the first to stand up against Margaret. He looked older, more worn, but there was a sense of relief in his eyes. "Evening, Walter," Ethan Hall greeted, tipping his hat. "Mind if I join you?" Walter gestured to an empty chair. "Pull up a seat, Hall." "What brings you by?" Hall sat down, his hands resting on his knees. "I just wanted to thank you both. What you did. It wasn't just about SAVYing your home. It was about SAVYing this neighborhood from itself. Margaret's reign was toxic, and it took someone like you, Ethan, to show us the way out." Ethan nodded, acknowledging the compliment but remaining humble. "I just did what I thought was right. This neighborhood should be a place where people can live without fear of being harassed over trivial things." Hall sighed, looking out over the quiet street. "You're right, and I think we're finally on the right path. The new board is committed to making this a community where everyone feels welcome. No more power trips, no more vendettas." Walter raised his coffee cup in a toast. "Here's to a brighter future for Willow Creek." As the three men sat in companionable silence, the sound of children playing in the distance filled the air. It was a sound that had been missing for too long, a sign that the neighborhood was finally coming back to life. Months turned into a year, and the transformation of Willow Creek was nothing short of remarkable. The once stifling atmosphere had been replaced by a sense of freedom and camaraderie. Neighbors who had once avoided each other now greeted one another with smiles and waves. Community events, once rare and poorly attended, became regular occurrences, drawing families together in celebration. Ethan had become something of a local hero, though he shied away from the spotlight. He preferred to work behind the scenes, ensuring that the neighborhood remained a safe and welcoming place for everyone. His bond with Walter had only grown stronger, and the two spent countless hours reminiscing about the past and planning for the future. One crisp winter morning, as the first snow of the season blanketed the neighborhood, Ethan received an unexpected sighter. It was Margaret Holloway. She looked different, smaller, less imposing. The fire that had once burned in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a quiet resignation. She stood on the porch, her hands clasped in front of her, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Margaret, what brings you here?" She took a deep breath, her gaze dropping to the ground. I wanted to apologize. To you, to Walter, to the entire neighborhood. I was wrong. I let my desire for control blind me to what was truly important. I hurt people, and I regret that." Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Apology accepted. But it's not just me you need to make amends with. The whole neighborhood felt your wrath." Margaret nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know, and I plan to make things right. I've been volunteering at the community center, trying to give back in whatever way I can. It's not much, but it's a start." Ethan offered a small smile. "It's a good start. We all make mistakes, Margaret. What matters is what we do to fix them." She nodded again, a sense of relief washing over her. "Thank you, Ethan, for everything." As she turned to leave, Ethan called after her. "Margaret." She paused, looking back. "Don't be a stranger. This is your home, too." For the first time in a long time, Margaret smiled a genuine, heartfelt smile. "Thank you." Despite the peace that had settled over Willow Creek, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The neighborhood had healed, and Margaret Holloway had seemingly turned over a new leaf. But there were whispers, small, almost imperceptible, that hinted at trouble brewing beneath the surface. It started with minor incidents: a vandalized mailbox here, a broken window there. At first, Ethan dismissed them as random acts of mischief, but the pattern was too consistent to ignore. One evening, as Ethan walked home from a community meeting, he noticed a figure lurking in the shadows near Walter's house. The person was dressed in dark clothing, their face obscured by a hood. Ethan's instincts kicked in, and he quietly followed the figure, keeping his distance. The stranger moved with purpose, stopping near the backyard fence before slipping through a gap and disappearing into the night. Ethan's heart raced. He knew the neighborhood's history too well to ignore this. He quickly checked the security cameras Walter had installed years ago, pulling up the footage from the past few nights. What he saw made his blood run cold. The same figure had been spotted multiple times, always at night, always near Walter's property. But this time, the person wasn't alone. There were others, 3, maybe 4, working in tandem. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of Walter shouting from the kitchen. He rushed downstairs to find his grandfather standing in the middle of the room, his face pale and his hands trembling. The floor was littered with shredded paper, chewed wires, and droppings. The rats were back. Ethan's jaw tightened as he surveyed the damage. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was targeting them again. He immediately checked the security footage from the pre-VYS night, and his suspicions were confirmed. The same group of figures had returned, this time carrying small crates. They had dumped the contents into the vents, just as they had done years ago. But this time, Ethan was ready. He had learned from the past, and he wasn't about to let history repeat itself. He called a meeting with the new HOA board, presenting the EVY Denke and urging them to take action. The board, still wary of the neighborhood's dark history, agreed to increase security and patrols. But Ethan knew that wouldn't be enough. He needed to find out who was behind this and put a stop to it once and for all. Ethan spent the next few nights staking out the neighborhood, watching and waiting. He didn't have to wait long. On the third night, he spotted the figures again, this time near Roger Clark's old house. Roger had moved away after the snake incident, but the house had recently been sold to a new family. Ethan followed the group, staying hidden in the shadows as they approached the property. As they began to unload their crates, Ethan made his move. He stepped into the light, his voice calm but firm. "You've got two choices. Drop what you're doing and leave, or explain yourselves to the police." The figures froze, their faces hidden beneath their hoods. For a moment, no one moved. Then, one of them stepped forward, pulling back their hood to reveal a face Ethan hadn't seen in years. Margaret Holloway. Ethan's eyes narrowed. "Margaret, I should have known." Margaret's expression was a mix of defiance and desperation. "You think you've won, Ethan? You think you can just erase everything I've built? This neighborhood was mine long before you showed up, and it'll be mine again." Ethan shook his head. "It was never yours, Margaret. It belongs to the people who live here, and they've made it clear they don't want you back." Margaret's face twisted in anger, but before she could respond, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Ethan had called the police as soon as he'd spotted the group, and now they were closing in. Margaret and her accomplices tried to flee, but they were quickly surrounded and arrested. The arrest of Margaret Holloway and her accomplices sent shockwaves through Willow Creek. The neighborhood had hoped to put the past behind them, but Margaret's return was a stark reminder of how fragile peace could be. The new HOA board worked tirelessly to reassure residents, implementing stricter security measures and fostering a sense of unity. Margaret's trial was swift. She was charged with vandalism, harassment, and conspiracy, and her accomplices, former HOA members who had remained loyal to her, faced similar charges. In the end, Margaret was sentenced to several years in prison, effectively ending her reign of terror. Ethan and Walter attended the trial, not out of spite, but to ensure that justice was served. As they left the courthouse, Walter placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You did it, son. You protected this neighborhood, just like you always do." Ethan smiled, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I just wish it hadn't come to this." Margaret could have changed. She could have been a part of this community again. Walter nodded. "Some people are too set in their ways to change. But that's not on you. You've done more than anyone could have asked for." With Margaret finally gone, Willow Creek entered a new era of peace and prosperity. The neighborhood became a model of community spirit, with residents working together to create a safe and welcoming environment for everyone. Ethan, now a respected leader in the community, continued to honor his grandfather's legacy by ensuring that Willow Creek remained a place where people could thrive. Walter lived to see his 100th birthday, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors who had become like family. His home, once the target of harassment, stood as a symbol of resilience and strength. And Ethan, now a father himself, passed on the lessons he had learned to his children, teaching them the importance of standing up for what's right and protecting those you love. As the sun set on another peaceful day, Ethan stood on the porch, looking out over the neighborhood he had fought so hard to protect. The sound of laughter and conversation filled the air, a testament to the enduring spirit of Willow Creek. Walter's voice broke through his thoughts. "You did good, Ethan. Real good." Ethan turned to his grandfather, a smile playing on his lips. "We did good, Grandpa. Together." Walter nodded, his eyes twinkling with pride. "That we did, son. That we did." And as the two men sat side by side, watching the world go by, they knew that their legacy would live on, a legacy of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bond of family. Years later, as Ethan's children played in the yard, a new family moved into the neighborhood. They were greeted with open arms, welcomed into a community that had learned the value of unity and resilience. The story of Ethan and Walter's fight for justice became a part of Willow Creek's history, a reminder of what could be achieved when people stood together. And as the sun set on another peaceful day, the laughter of children echoed through the streets, a testament to the enduring spirit of Willow Creek, a neighborhood that had faced its darkest days and emerged stronger than ever. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.